Dear Professor Καντάβα, αγαπητέ Πρόεδρε του ΣΥΡΙΖΑ Προοδευτική Συμμαχία, κυρίες και κύριοι, φίλοι και φίλες. Εκ μέρους του Ινστιτούτου μας, σας καλωσορίζω με ιδιαίτερη χαρά στη 18η Διάλεξη στη μνήμη του Νίκου Πουλαντζά. Οι ετήσιες διαλέξεις, αισίως 18 τον αριθμό, αποτελούν πλέον ένα θεσμό για μας και ταυτόχρονα μια μεγάλη ευκαιρία για να γνωρίσουμε από κοντά και να ακούσουμε σημαντικούς διανοητές του σύγχρονου κόσμου, όπως ο Μπομπ Τζέσοπ, η Τζούντιτ Μπάτλερ, ο Μάικ Λίποβιτς, η Νάνσι Φρέιζερ, ο Μικαέλ Λεβί, η Άντζελα Ντέιβις ή ο δικός μας Κωνσταντίνος Τσουκαλάς. Μεγάλα ονόματα και σπουδαία θέματα για να κατανοήσουμε το σύγχρονο κόσμο, απαραίτητη προϋπόθεση για να τον αλλάξουμε. Πολιτική οικολογία, φεμινισμός, ο σοσιαλισμός στον 21ο αιώνα, η Ευρώπη στο έλεος των αγορών, ο αυταρχικός καπιταλισμός, οι νέες μορφές εξουσίας, η ψηφιακή συνθήκη και άλλα πολλά διαμόρφωσαν την εξαιρετικά πλούσια θεματογραφία των ετήσιων διαλέξεων του Ινστιτούτου μας. Σήμερα έχουμε την τιμή και τη χαρά να φιλοξενούμε έναν από τους σημαντικότερους σύγχρονους θεωρητικούς που εργάζονται πάνω στη σχέση μεταξύ ιστορίας, μνήμης, τεχνολογιών των μέσων και πολιτικής θεωρίας, τον Εντουάρντο Καντάβα, καθηγητή στο Πανεπιστήμιο Πρίνστον, για τον οποίο θα αποφύγω τον πειρασμό να πω περισσότερα, καθώς είναι κοντά μας η καθηγήτρια Μίνα Καραβαντά, και την ευχαριστούμε θερμά γι' αυτό, αναπληρώτρια καθηγήτρια στο ΕΚΠΑ και βαθιά γνώστρια του έργου του για να τον παρουσιάσει όπως του πρέπει. Πριν της δώσουμε το λόγο, επιτρέψτε μου κάποιες σκέψεις για το θέμα της σημερινής μας εκδήλωσης ή καλύτερα για μια σημαντική πτυχή του θέματος της σημερινής εκδήλωσης. Θα ξεκινήσω με μια βασική παραδοχή. Η ιστορία αναφέρεται στο παρελθόν, αλλά δεν είναι το παρελθόν. Είναι ένας από τους βασικούς τρόπους με τους οποίους οργανώνουμε το παρόν και φανταζόμαστε το μέλλον. Η ιστορία λειτουργεί ταυτόχρονα αναδρομικά, αλλά και προληπτικά, κανονιστικά και νομιμοποιητικά. Όπως έχει δείξει η κριτική θεωρία, κάθε ιστορική αφήγηση συγκροτείται μέσα από πράξεις επιλογής, ιεράρχησης και αποκλεισμού. Και αυτές οι πράξεις δεν είναι ουδέτερες. Ο τίτλος της εκδήλωσής μας υποδηλώνει ήδη μια συνομιλία με τις παραπάνω παραδοχές. Δεν μας καλεί να διαβάσουμε καλύτερα την ιστορία, αλλά να μάθουμε στην ίδια την ιστορία να διαβάζει τα ίχνη που άφησε πίσω της, τις σιωπές της, τις ζωές που δεν εντάχθηκαν ποτέ στις αφηγήσεις της. Ζούμε σε έναν κόσμο όπου η ιστορία επιστρατεύεται διαρκώς για να εξηγήσει, να νομιμοποιήσει ή και να δικαιολογήσει συγκρούσεις και βία. Από τα Βαλκάνια της δεκαετίας του 90, όπου ανακατασκευασμένες ιστορικές μνήμες παρήγαγαν την ιδέα των αιώνιων εχθρών, μέχρι τη ρωσική εισβολή στην Ουκρανία, όπου η ιστορία ερμηνεύεται εκ νέου για να θεμελιώσει εδαφικές και πολιτικές αξιώσεις, το παρελθόν λειτουργεί ως ηθικό και πολιτικό άλοθη για την άσκηση της βίας. Και η ιστορία, όταν δεν διαβάζει τη βία που διαπράττεται στο όνομά της, μετατρέπεται ίδια σε μια τεχνολογία αποκλεισμού. Η ελληνική εμπειρία δεν αποτελεί εξαίρεση. Ο εμφύλιος πόλεμος υπήρξε όχι μόνο ένα ιστορικό γεγονός, αλλά ένα καθεστώς μνήμης. Για δεκαετίες η ιστορία του οργανώθηκε μέσα από απαγορεύσεις, εξορίες, πιστοποιητικά κοινωνικών φρονημάτων, μέσα από αυτό που ο Μισελ Φουκώ θα περιέγραφε ως κανονιστική παραγωγή της αλήθειας. Δεν επρόκειτο απλώς για το τι υπόθηκε, αλλά για το τι επιτρεπόταν να υποθεί ή ακόμα και για ποια σώματα θεωρούνταν αναλώσιμα και ποια πενθήσιμα. Δεν είναι λοιπόν μόνο ποια ιστορία λέγεται, αλλά και ποια ιστορία δεν μπορεί να υποθεί. Στη Νότια Αφρική, η Επιτροπή Αλήθειας και Συμφιλίωσης ανέδειξε ότι το Apartheid δεν ήταν απλώς ένα πολιτικό καθεστώς, αλλά ένα καθεστώς αρχαιακής οργάνωσης της μνήμης. Στον Καναδά, οι αποκαλύψεις για τα σχολεία ηθαγενών πληθυσμών έδειξαν ότι η αποικιακή βία δεν τελείωσε, κληροδοτήθηκε μέσω της λύθης, μέσω της διαγραφής της. Η διαγραφή, επομένως, δεν είναι απουσία. Είναι ενεργητική, παραγωγική πράξη. Και η διαχείριση της μνήμης επίσης. Η καθυστερημένη αναγνώριση της βίας της κατοχής σε εμάς, η αμφιθυμία γύρω από τη συνεργασία με τον ναζισμό ή ακόμα και ο τρόπος με τον οποίο η μικρασιατική καταστροφή ενσωματώθηκε στη δημόσια ιστορία δείχνουν ότι η μνήμη συγκροτείται μέσα από επιλογές που εξυπηρετούν ιδεολογικά και πολιτικά προτάγματα σε βάρος της ιστορικής ευθύνης. Τι σημαίνει λοιπόν ο τίτλος της εκδήλωσής μας «Να μάθουμε την ιστορία να διαβάζει»? Σημαίνει να απαιτήσουμε από την ιστορία να διαβάσει τα ίχνη της, τις σιωπές, τις ρογμές, τις ασυνέχειές της. Η τριλογία της διαγραφής του Φάζαλ Σέικ και το έργο του Εντουάρντο Καντάβα μας προσκαλούν ακριβώς σε αυτή τη δύσκολη ανάγνωση σε μια βαθιά τραυματισμένη γη, την Παλαιστίνη, στην οποία η βία δεν είναι μόνο επεισόδια πολέμου, αλλά μια μακροχρόνια διαδικασία εξαφάνισης των Παλαιστινίων με όπλα, με λέξεις, με ημερομηνίες, με ονομασίες. Σήμερα ολόκληρες γειτονιές της Γάζας σβήνονται από το χάρτη, μαζί με τα ανθρώπινα ίχνη σε αυτές. Βομβαρδισμένα τοπία μετατρέπονται σε ουδέτερες ζώνες. Πρόκειται για μια συνολική διαγραφή, ανθρωπιστική, οικολογική, χωρική, μια διαγραφή που η τριλογία του Σέικ φωτογράφησε και μας έδειξε τη συνέχειά της. Όχι απλώς τι έχει χαθεί, αλλά και πώς χάνεται ξανά και ξανά. Μας διδάσκει ότι δεν ξεκίνησε τώρα, ότι δεν αφορά μόνο τη Γάζα και δεν θα τελειώσει με μια εκεχηρία αν δεν αναγνωριστεί η ιστορική διαγραφή που έχει γίνει. Σας ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ελπίζω να μην μακρηγόρησα πολύ. Θα δώσω το λόγο τώρα στη Μίνα Καραβαντά και αμέσως μετά στον Εντουάρντο Καντάβα. Ευχαριστούμε θερμά την καθηγήτρια Μίνα Καραβαντά και την καλούμε στο βήμα.
Καλησπέρα, σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ για την πρόσκληση, την τιμή και ευχαριστώ τον φίλο μου και αγαπητό συνάδελφο Εντουάρντο Καντάβα για την εμπιστοσύνη που δείχνει στο πρόσωπό μου για να πω λίγα λόγια για το πολύ σημαντικό και πολύ σχηδές έργο του. Θα ξεκινήσω με μερικά λόγια που θα μπορούσατε να τα έχετε και μόνοι σας ανακαλύψει κοιτώντας το τεράστιο βιογραφικό του και στη συνέχεια θα πω λίγα λόγια για το κριτικό του αποτύπωμα όπως το αντιλαμβάνομαι εγώ μέσα από το έργο του. Ο Εντουάρντο Καντάβα είναι Philip Mayhew, καθηγητής Αγγλικής Φιλολογίας στα τμήματα της Αγγλικής Φιλολογίας, του τμήματος Συγκριτικής Λογοτεχνίας, Ισπανικών και Πορτογαλικών Σπουδών, της Σχολής Αρχιτεκτονικής, καθώς επίσης και το Stiges Center for Hellenic Studies στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Πρίνστον. Έχει διετελέσει καθηγητής φιλοσοφίας στο θερινό πρόγραμμα του European Graduate School και επισκέπτης καθηγητής στη Σχολή της Αρχιτεκτονικής του Cooper Union. Έχει επίσης διδάξει στο θερινό σχολείο διάσημο θερινό σχολείο κριτικής και θεωρίας του Πανεπιστημίου Κορνέλ, καθώς επίσης έχει διετελέσει και επισκέπτης καθηγητής στο San Francisco Art Institute, αλλά και στο τμήμα πολιτικής επιστήμης του δικού μας Πανεπιστημίου, του Εθνικού και Καποδιστριακού Πανεπιστημίου Αθηνών. Ειδικεύεται στην Αμερικανική Λογοτεχνία και Κουλτούρα, τη συγκριτική λογοτεχνία, τις τεχνολογίες των μέσων, τη λογοτεχνική και πολιτική θεωρία, τη θεωρία της μετάφρασης, καθώς και σε ζητήματα ηθαγένειας και ανθρωπίνων δικαιωμάτων. Έχει γράψει εκτενώς για τη λογοτεχνία, τη φιλοσοφία, την φωτογραφία, την αρχιτεκτονική, τη μουσική, τη δημοκρατία, τον πόλεμο, τη μνήμη και τη λύθη, τη φυλή και τη δουλεία, τα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα και την ηθαγένεια, καθώς και για την ηθική της απόφασης. Είναι συγγραφέας των βιβλίων Words of Light, Thesis on the Photography of History, το επιστημονικό οίκο του Πανεπιστημίου Πρίνστον, του Emerson and the Climates of History, ο Emerson δηλαδή και τα κλίματα της ιστορίας, και σε συνεργασία με τον Φάζαλ Σέικ, το έργο του Φάζαλ Σέικ Portraits, Τα δύο αυτά πιο πρόσφατα βιβλία του είναι το Paper Graveyards, που εκδόθηκε από τον εκδοτικό οίκο MIT Press το 2021 και τιμήθηκε με το Frank Jewett Mather Award για την κριτική από την Ένωση College Art το 2023 και ένα πολύ σημαντικό κείμενο, το Politically Read, σε συνεργασία με τη Σάρα Ναδάλ Μελσιό, που εκδόθηκε από τον εκδοτικό οίκο πάλι MIT Press το 2023 και έλαβε έφημο μνήμα από του βραβείου René Velek Prize της Αμερικανικής Εταιρείας Συγκριτικών Λογοτεχνικών Σπουδών το 2024. Έχει συνεπιμεληθεί πολύ σημαντικούς τόμους όπως το Who Comes After the Subject, Cities Without Citizens, πόλεις χωρίς πολίτες δηλαδή, και επίσης ένα ωραίο τεύχος, ειδικό τεύχος με θέμα Unjustice for All, δικαιοσύνη για όλους, The Claims of Human Rights, τα αιτήματα για τα ανθρώπινα δικαιώματα. Ανάμεσα σε πάρα πολλά άλλα, τα οποία πραγματικά θα θέλαμε πολύ χρόνο μόνο απλώς να αναφέρουμε. Έχει μεταφράσει έργα των Jacques Derrida, Philippe Lacoue-Labarthe και Maurice Branchot, καθώς επίσης και τα απομνημονεύματα του Νάδαρ, Quand j'étais photographe, όταν ήμουν φωτογράφος, το οποίο εκδόθηκε από το MIT Press το 2015. Το 2018 έλαβε το President's Award for Distinguished Teaching για τον καλύτερο, που δίνεται στον καλύτερο διδάσκοντα, και το γνωρίζουμε αυτό όσοι έχουμε συμμετάσχει σε σεμινάρια και έχουμε ακούσει διαλέξεις του. Και το καλοκαίρι του 2019 του απονεμήθηκε τιμητικά ελληνική ηθαγένεια για την προώθηση του ελληνικού πολιτισμού στο εξωτερικό. Και τώρα μερικές σκέψεις για το έργο του. Το έργο του Εντουάρντο Καντάβα κατέχει μια ιδιαίτερη θέση στη σύγχρονη θεωρία, καθώς αναδιατάσσει τη φιλοσοφική σκέψη, τη λογοτεχνική κριτική και την πολιτική θεωρία, ώστε να απαντήσει σε κέρια αλλά και διαχρονικά ερωτήματα. Ερωτήματα που αφορούν το δικαίωμα στα δικαιώματα όλων και ιδίως των πληθυσμών χωρίς ηθαγένεια, των εκτοπισμένων από τη γη τους, αλλά και εκείνων που βρίσκονται εκτοπισμένοι εντός της ίδιας τους της γης. Καθώς και την έννοια του πολύτυπου κειμένου, citizen subject, η οποία διαμορφώνεται στη συνθήκη της απικιακής νεωτερικότητας και στη συνέχεια από τις πολιτικές της αποαπικιοκρατίας, αλλά και της νέο-απικιοκρατίας. Πρόκειται λοιπόν για ένα υποκείμενο που στοιχιώνεται από κρίσιμα ερωτήματα. Υπάρχει εναλλακτική μετά την ολοκληρωτική του πραγμάτωση? Και πώς μπορούμε να κατανοήσουμε τα ερείπια της απικιοκρατίας, όχι μόνο ως απομεινάρια της ιστορίας ή ως μνημεία ενταγμένα σε ένα ενιαίο κυρίαρχο αφήγημα, αλλά ως ίχνη ιστοριών που αντιστέκονται στο χρόνο μέσα από την αμφίσιμη και επίμονη παρουσία των ερειπίων και των στοιχειών τους. Τα ερείπια αποτελούν για τον Καντάβα τον τόπο της ανασκαφής, της ανέβρεσης και της αναδύφισης του παρόντος, ενώ τα στοιχεία τους λειτουργούν ως μάρτυρες των γεγονότων της καταστροφής ανθρώπων και πλανήτη. Μάρτυρες που επιστρέφουν, όπως ο άγγελος της ιστορίας, του Βάλτερ Μπένιαμιν, με το αίτημα της αναγνώρισης και της δικαιοσύνης. Ο Καντάβα συνομιλεί με τα στοιχεία, ανταποκρινόμενος στο αίτημα του Jacques Derrida, να μάθουμε επιτέλους, και ιδιαίτερα μετά από αυτές τις καταστροφές, να συνομιλούμε μαζί τους με το βλέμμα σταθερά στραμμένο προς το παρόν. Το έργο του Καντάβα μας υπενθυμίζει ότι ο άνεμος που φυσά και μας οθεί ασταμάτητα προς το μέλλον δεν πνέει από τον παράδεισο, αλλά από ερημοποιημένα εδάφη και σωρούς ερειπίων σε τόπους όπως η Γιούτα, ο Αμαζόνιος και η Γάζα. Τόπους εξόρυξης, υπερεξόρυξης εδαφών και απογύμνωσης της γης που έχουν προκληθεί από πολιτικές απικιοκρατικού εξαιρετισμού. Τόπους με δικές τους ιστορίες εκτοπισμού των γηγενών πληθυσμών. Ο Καντάβα αναστοχάζεται την ιστορία ως μια εύθραυστη και ανολοκλήρωτη διαδικασία, διαμεσολαβημένη από τη γλώσσα, τις εικόνες και τις μορφές μετάδοσής της. Μορφές πάντοτε εκτεθειμένες στην απώλεια. Το βιβλίο του με τίτλο Paper Graveyards είναι προϊόν ενός εκτενούς και συνεκτικού στοχασμού του Καντάβα πάνω στην ιστορία, τη μνήμη και την απώλεια. Με επίκεντρο τη φωτογραφία, το έργο του αυτό προσεγγίζει τις εικόνες όχι ως αδιάσυστα τεκμήρια, αλλά ως τόπους πένθους, όπου η ιστορία επιβιώνει με τρόπο εύθραυστο και ατελή. Η φωτογραφία στο έργο του Εντουάρδο νοείται ως τεχνολογία διατήρησης και εξαφάνισης, ως ένα χάρτινο νεκροταφείο. Αυτός θα ήταν και ένας φτωχός τρόπος να αποδοθεί ο τίτλος, στο οποίο το παρελθόν θάβεται χωρίς να σιωπά. Αντλώντας από τον Μπένιαμιν, τον Ρόλαντ Μπάρτ και τον Ντεριντά, ο Καντάβα υποστηρίζει ότι οι εικόνες δεν διαφυλάσσουν απλώς το παρελθόν, αλλά το καθιστούν παρόν και ενεργό, φέροντας πολλαπλά δίκτυα νοήματος αντί ενός μοναδικού σημείου αναφοράς. Το τελευταίο του κείμενο, σε συνεργασία με τη Σάρα Ναδάλ Μεσιό, με τίτλο Politically Red, και εδώ παίζει η λέξη red, κόκκινο, και red, κάτι που έχει αναγνωστεί και θα μπορούσαμε να το αποδώσουμε ως η κόκκινη ανάγνωση και το πολιτικά κόκκινο, αποτελεί ένα τολμηρό και θεωρητικά πρωτότυπο έργο που υποστηρίζει ότι η ανάγνωση και η γραφή δεν είναι ούτε ουδέτερες ούτε ιδιωτικές πράξεις, αλλά εγενώς πολιτικές και συλλογικές πρακτικές. Στο επίκεντρο αυτού του βιβλίου βρίσκεται η έννοια της κόκκινης κοινότητας, ενός αρχείου πολιτικών, ιστορικών και αντιρατσιστικών πηγών που αναδύεται μέσα από τη συλλογική πρακτική της ανάγνωσης και της γραφής. Μέσα από αναγνώσεις στοχαστών όπως είναι η Καρλ Μάρξ, Ρόζα Λούξεμπουργκ, Βάλτερ Μπένιαμιν, W.E.B. Du Bois, Φρέντρικ Τζέιμσον, οι συγγραφείς καταδεικνύουν πώς η ιστορία συγκροτείται μέσα από τη βία και τον αγώνα και πώς η ανάγνωση και η γραφή συνιστούν συλλογικές ακτιβιστικές πράξεις σε αναζήτηση ενός κοινού αγαθού. Και δανείζομαι την τελευταία τους παράγραφο στην κατακλείδα, στο τελευταίο κεφάλαιο αυτού του βιβλίου, που είναι και ένα μανιφέστο για να εξηγήσω τι εννοούν με το κοινό αγαθό. Στο κοινό αγαθό, λένε η Καντάβα και Ναδάλ Μεσιό, δεν υπάρχει υποκείμενο. Υπάρχει μόνο μια πολυεπίπεδη διαδικασία συναντήσεων, συνασπισμών, συμμαχιών, με απρόβλεπτες μορφές και εκβάσεις και μάλιστα με μια σχέση προς το μέλλον, προς το ελευσόμενο. Το κοινό αγαθό ανήκει στην κινητικότητα μιας ατέρμονης διαδικασίας χωρίς υποκείμενο. Μιας διαδικασίας που δεν θα σωπάσει μπροστά στη βία του καπιταλισμού, ούτε θα αποστραφεί τη δική της βία, που είναι αδύνατο να μετατραπεί σε δόγμα ή να συντεθεί σε ένα σύστημα, που θα πετύσει μια ανάγνωση η οποία υπερβαίνει το κείμενο, ώστε να καταστήσει κάθε κείμενο τόπο συναντήσεων και δυνατοτήτων. Μιας διαδικασίας που διακινδυνεύει να είναι πολιτική, επειδή γνωρίζει ότι η πολιτική είναι το μόνο μέσο που διαθέτουμε, όχι μόνο για να συναντήσουμε το ανυπολόγιστο, αλλά και για να το μεγιστοποιήσουμε. Πρόκειται για μια πολιτική που δεν μπορεί ποτέ να έχει καθορισμένη ή σταθερή μορφή και που εξαιτίας του κινδύνου μιας σχεδόν αναπόφευκτης συνενοχής με ό,τι πιστεύει, ό,τι κινείται προς το χειρότερο, οφείλει να παραμείνει σε κίνηση. Το ζητούμενο, λένε, είναι πώς να τεθούν οι μάζες σε κίνηση. Αυτό το καθήκον εμπλέκεται σε μια δραστηριότητα ανάγνωσης και γραφής, η οποία, συσσωρεύοντας τη δύναμή της μέσω του κοινού αγαθού που κινητοποιεί, μας υπενθυμίζει ότι όποτε σκεφτόμαστε και αγωνιζόμαστε για την αλλαγή, δεν είμαστε ποτέ μόνοι μας. Συνολικά στο έργο του, ο Καντάβα αναπτύσσει έναν τρόπο άσκησης της κριτικής που δεν είναι ούτε καθαρά ερμηνευτικός, ούτε συμβατικά ιστορικός. Ο κριτικός του λόγος δεν καθοδηγείται από τη λογική της κυριαρχίας ή της ερμηνευτικής επιβολής, αλλά από μια στάση ακρόασης. Ακρόασης προς ό,τι απομένει, προς ό,τι τρεμοπαίζει, προς ό,τι επιμένει στα περιθώρια της αναπαράστασης. Η ίδια η γραφή του Καντάβα ενσαρκώνει αυτή τη στάση. Καθυστερεί, περιφέρεται, επιστρέφει, επιτρέποντας το νόημα να αναδυθεί μέσα από επανάληψη και τονική μεταβολή και όχι μέσα από ρητορική κατάληξη. Ένα από τα αξιοσημείωτα χαρακτηριστικά της κριτικής του Καντάβα είναι η επιμονή του ότι η ίδια η κριτική οφείλει να υιοθετεί μια ηθική της αναστολής. Αντί να ισχυρίζεται ότι μιλά εκ μέρους των νεκρών ή ότι δικαιώνει την ιστορία μέσω της ερμηνείας, προτείνει μια μορφή κριτικής που αναγνωρίζει τα όρια της και αντιστέκεται στην ιδιοποίηση του πόνου. Στο σύνολο αυτού του έργου αναδύονται ορισμένα καθοριστικά χαρακτηριστικά της πνευματικής χαρισματικότητας του Εντουάρντο. Η σταθερή προσήλωσή του στο εύθραστο, η άρνησή του να αποδεχθεί γραμμικές αντιλήψεις του χρόνου, η ρητορική του ακρίβεια και η ποιητική του δύναμη, μέσω των οποίων αφήνει τη γλώσσα να σκέφτεται. Και τέλος, η βαθιά ηθική του ταπεινότητα, και αυτό πάντα με συγκινεί και με εκπλήσει στον Εντουάρντο, μια κριτική που δεν ηθικολογεί, αλλά αναγνωρίζει την εμπλοκή του ίδιου του κριτικού σε ιστορίες βίας και αναπαράστασης. Απόδειξη της εμπλοκής του αυτής αποτελεί το ερευνητικό πρόγραμμα Conflict Shorelines, ακτογραμμές σύγκρουσης θα μπορούσαμε να το μεταφράσουμε, ένα πολυετές ερευνητικό πρόγραμμα για τη σχέση μεταξύ πολιτικής σύγκρουσης και κλιματικής αλλαγής, το οποίο περιλαμβάνει επιτόπια έρευνα στην Αμαζονία, στην έρημο Νεγκέβ και στην Αρκτική. Συνεργάζεται επίσης με το Φάζαλ Σέικ στο project Exposure, που αποσκοπεί στην τεκμηρίωση της καταστροφής του τοπίου της Γιούτα, από την εξόρυξη ουρανίου και τις γεωτρήσεις πετρελαίου και φυσικού αερίου, καθώς και των συνοποιών αυτής της καταστροφής στις αυτόχθονες κοινότητες. Αντί να αντιμετωπίζουν την κλιματική αλλαγή ως ένα αφηρημένο παγκόσμιο φαινόμενο ή ως αποκλειστικό αντικείμενο των φυσικών επιστημών, τα προγράμματα αυτά την προσεγγίζουν ως υλικό, χωρικό και πολιτικό γεγονός, άρρηκτα δεμένο με ιστορίες αποικιοκρατίας, εκτοπισμού, εξόρυξης, αλλά και περιβαλλοντικής αδικίας. Η έννοια αυτή, conflict shorelines, ακτογραμμών της σύγκρουσης, λειτουργεί εδώ όχι μόνο ως γεωγραφική μεταφορά, αλλά ως αναλυτικό εργαλείο. Αναδεικνύει τις ζώνες όπου οι περιβαλλοντικές μεταβολές εντείνουν προϋπάρχουσες σχέσεις εξουσίας και ανισότητας. Το πρόγραμμα καταδεικνύει ότι οι συγκρούσεις γύρω από τη γη, το νερό, την ενέργεια και τους φυσικούς πόρους δεν είναι απλώς συνέπειες της κλιματικής κρίσης, αλλά δομικά χαρακτηριστικά ενός παγκόσμιου καθεστώτος εκμετάλλευσης που καθιστά ορισμένους πληθυσμούς αναλώσιμους. Η σημασία αυτών των προγραμμάτων, conflict shorelines και exposure, έγκυται στο ότι προτείνουν ένα διαφορετικό τρόπο ακαδημαϊκής πρακτικής. Ένα πρότυπο όπου η έρευνα δεν είναι περιορισμένη και αποκομμένη από τον κόσμο, αλλά παρεμβαίνει ενεργά σε αυτόν, μέσα από τη διεπιστημονικότητα, τη συνεργασία με τις πληττόμενες κοινότητες, αυτόχθονες πληθυσμούς στο Αμαζόνιο, Βεδουίνους στην Εγκέβ, φυλές της Νοτιοδυτικής Αμερικής, και τη μετατροπή της γνώσης σε πολιτικό και νομικό εργαλείο, το έργο αυτό αναδεικνύει με παραδειγματικό τρόπο τη μορφή του οργανικού διανοούμενου. Ενός διανοούμενου που δεν παρατηρεί απλώς την κρίση, αλλά συμμετέχει στη διαμόρφωση των όρων με τους οποίους αυτή μπορεί να αμφισβητηθεί και να μετασχηματιστεί. Ιδιαίτερη σημασία έχει το γεγονός ότι τα προγράμματα αυτά δεν περιορίζονται στην θεωρητική ανάλυση για δημοσιεύσεις απλώς, αλλά αναπτύσσουν αποδεικτικές πρακτικές, ικανές να λειτουργήσουν τόσο στο δημόσιο πεδίο όσο και στο νομικό. Η παραγωγή χαρτών, περιβαλλοντικών μοντέλων, αισθητηριακών τεκμηρίων και αφηγήσεων δεν αποσκοπεί μόνο στη γνώση, αλλά και στη λογοδοσία. Με αυτόν τον τρόπο η έρευνα μετατρέπεται σε εργαλείο υπεράσπισης δικαιωμάτων, ανθρωπίνων και μη, και σε μέσο πολιτικής παρέμβασης. Η τριλογία του Φάζαλ Σέικ, αντικείμενο της σημερινής ομιλίας του Εντουάρντο, που περιλαμβάνει 3 έργα, Memory Trace, ίχνος μνήμης, Independence Nakba, ανεξαρτησία Nakba, Desert Bloom, η άνθηση της ερήμου, αποτελεί μια βαθιά και συστηματική διερεύνηση της εκδίωξης της απώλειας υπηκότητας και της εύθραυστης επιβίωσης υπό συνθήκες πολιτικής και περιβαλλοντικής βίας. Σε αυτά τα έργα ο Σέικ αποφεύγει την άμεση θέαση και το θέαμα που χαρακτηρίζουν τη συμβατική ανθρωπιστική φωτογραφία. Αντίθετα, όπως θα δείτε, εστιάζει σε ίχνη, σε ατμόσφαιρες και σε ηρικά περιβάλλοντα που διαμορφώνουν τη ζωή αυτών που ζουν σε συνθήκες ευαλωτότητας. Τα πορτρέτα και τα τοπία του απαιτούν ηθική εμπλοκή από τον θεατή, καλώντας τον να σταθεί απέναντι στα υποκείμενα των εικόνων και δίπλα τους, αντί να καταναλώσει τον πόνο τους. Ο Σέικ φωτογραφίζει αυτά που επιβιώνουν εν μέσω της εκδίωξης, είτε πρόκειται για τη εσωτερική οργάνωση ενός προσφυγικού καταβλισμού, τη μορφή ενός τοπίου που έχει σημαδευτεί από ανθρώπινη και περιβαλλοντική σύγκρουση, είτε για το βλέμμα ενός ατόμου το οποίο η ζωή έχει περιθωριοποιηθεί από τον νόμο, την εδαφικότητα ή τη βία. Οι φωτογραφίες του Σέικ και η θεωρητική σκέψη του Καντάβα δείχνουν ότι η απόδειξη του ανθρώπινου πόνου είναι πάντα μερική, συγκυριακή και ηθικά φορτισμένη. Στόχος τους δεν είναι η πλήρης αποκωδικοποίηση των γεγονότων, η κυριαρχία του δικού τους θεωρητικού λόγου πάνω στη σημασία τους, ένας κίνδυνος που αντιμετωπίζει τόσο η κριτική όσο και η φωτογραφική οπτικοποίηση του πόνου του άλλου, αλλά η ανάδειξη του πολιτικού βίου και των αιτημάτων όσων παραμένουν στα περιθώρια, δημιουργώντας παράλληλα μορφές αλληλεγγύης και αντίστασης που απαιτούν την ευθύνη του κριτικού ή του φωτογράφου να συνομιλήσει μαζί τους με τους δικούς τους όρους ή τουλάχιστον μέσα σε ένα κριτικό ιδίωμα που αποδομείται εκ των έσω. Από το punctum που διαταράσσει το studium για να αντιχύσουμε εδώ τον αγαπημένο Roland Barthes του Εντουάρντο, και που έχει τη συνείδηση, και αυτό είναι για μένα πολύ σημαντικό, το ότι να μιλάμε για τους άλλους δεν είναι το ίδιο με το να μιλάμε σε αυτούς. Αυτό κατορθώνεται στο έργο του Καντάβα μέσω της αποδεικτικής αισθητικής, όπου η μορφή, η διάρκεια και η υλικότητα συνδέονται αδιάσπαστα με την ηθική εμπλοκή. Και αυτό το βλέπουμε και στα κοντινά πορτρέτα του Σέικ, σε συνδυασμό με μαρτυρίες και κείμενα που δημιουργούν μια ηθική συνάντηση με τη ζωή των εκτοπισμένων και των προσφύγων. Επιπλέον, η ηθική στάση απέναντι στην έκθεση, η προσοχή στα ιστορικά ίχνη και η αυστηρή αποδεικτική πρακτική συνδέουν το Σέικ και τον Καντάβα σε μια κοινή άρνηση κυριαρχίας στη γνώση ή στην αναπαράσταση. Ο Σέικ δεν σώζει την ιστορία, ούτε απλοποιεί την ανθρώπινη εμπειρία. Και ο Καντάβα δεν επιδιώκει να σταθεροποιήσει ή να επιλύσει τα θραύσματα του παρελθόντος. Αντίθετα, και οι δύο καλλιεργούν μια μορφή προσοχής και ευθύνης που τονίζει την ηθική συνάντηση με το ευάλωτο και το μερικώς αόρατο. Διδάσκουν λοιπόν και οι δύο ότι η μαρτυρία δεν είναι απλώς μια πράξη θέασης, μέτρησης ή ερμηνείας. Είναι δέσμευση να παραμείνει κανείς με αυτό που είναι εύθραυστο, δίπλα σε αυτό που είναι ευάλωτο και εν μέρει αόρατο. Η ηθική ευθύνη αναδύεται όχι μέσα από την καθαρότητα ή την πληρότητα, αλλά μέσα από την επιμονή, τη φροντίδα και την προσοχή στα έχνη που επιβιώνουν. Προτείνουν μια κριτική και αισθητική ηθική στάση, όπου η ιστορία, η πολιτική και η οικολογία δεν τεκμηριώνονται απλώς, αλλά εμπλέκονται στην εύθραυστη συνέχειά τους, ζητώντας από εμάς να σκεφτούμε, να αισθανθούμε και να δράσουμε. Καταλήγω με αυτές τις προτάσεις και να μην σας κουράσω άλλο. Στην εποχή μας, μια εποχή οικολογικής κρίσης, πολιτικής εξάντλησης και αρχαιακού κορεσμού, η θεωρητική σκέψη που απαντά στο οντολογικό και συνάμα πολιτικό ερώτημα του ανήκειν είναι μια δημοκρατική πράξη αντίστασης. Το να διαβάζουμε για τον Εντουάρντο Καντάβα δεν σημαίνει να διασαφηνίζουμε το παρελθόν, αλλά να διατηρούμε πίστη στη μεταθανάτια ζωή του. Να παραμένουμε προσεκτικοί απέναντι στα εύθραυστα ίχνη, μέσω των οποίων η ιστορία συνεχίζει να μας απευθύνει αξιώσεις. Και το πιο σημαντικό από όλα για μένα, που κρατώ από το έργο του Εντουάρντο, αλλά και από το έργο του Φάζαλ Σέικ, με το οποίο με έφερε σε επαφή ο Εντουάρντο, είναι ότι το να συνομιλούμε με τα ερείπια και τα στοιχεία, κοιτώντας τα κατάματα με καθαρό βλέμμα και με φλέγουσα καρδιά που αισθάνεται κάθε τραύμα που έχει συσσωρευτεί στα ερείπια, έτσι ώστε και όταν φυσήξει ο άνεμος από τον παράδεισο να αφοσιωθούμε με πείσμα στο παρόν μέλλον, είναι το καθήκον μας. Το καθήκον μας να βρεθούμε και να στεκόμαστε δίπλα και μαζί με εκείνους που το διεκδικούν αυτό το παρόν μέλλον και που βρίσκονται εδώ για να το κληρονομήσουν. Σας ευχαριστώ πάρα πολύ.
I'm a little short. Thank you very much for being here. It's a great honor for me to be with you this evening. I want to thank you, Mina, for your very beautiful introduction. She was kind enough to give me an English translation. And actually, I should say that I'm sorry that I am speaking in English, but it is my language now. But thank you for your introduction and your friendship. I want to thank the Pulantζάς Institute for its invitation, and in this context, I wish to thank Maria Repusi for her kind welcome, and Andreas Maratos for the initial idea of including me in this series. I want to thank him also for his offer to translate my text into Greek, and in particular for his long friendship. It's very meaningful for me to be here under the auspices of this institute, and not least because Greece has become my adopted home. I also want to extend a special thanks to the translators and interpreters. I know this is a difficult task, so thank you. Before beginning, I just want to say a few words. We're living in a difficult and violent moment. We're experiencing all sorts of prohibitions against thinking, speaking, and acting. And these prohibitions go against what makes the work we do so critical. We cannot yet match the speed of the unraveling we're experiencing. But I believe that against this unraveling, we must keep doing what we do best, which is to continue thinking and speaking. One of the neuralgic points of dissension, the Trojan horse with which the current U.S. administration has made its incursions into the space of universities and into intellectual life, more generally, is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and especially the very complicated ways in which events have unfolded around the globe in the aftermath of October 7, 2023. While it is difficult, if not impossible, to trace all these complexities, it is surely the case that if we cannot distinguish between the denouncement of war crimes and anti-Semitism, we will remain entirely unprovided for in the ensuing attacks on the work we do. More than ever, it is our responsibility to make distinctions, to talk across differences, to teach at the same time that we learn, and to listen as best we can to what seems most threatening to us. What I will present today is part of a work in progress, part of a book I've been commissioned to write on Fazal Sheik's 3-volume photo book, The Erasure Trilogy, in which I trace the way in which these photographs can help us navigate our way through the thicket of the present conflict, which is not just one, and which does not belong to a specific geographical site. I believe that Fazal's multi-year engagement in Israel and Palestine provides us with a complex but nuanced entry into the thorniest knots of the conflict, a means of unlocking another way of proceeding in the face of the anguish and hopelessness that has increasingly become the signature of this seemingly endless conflict. This devastation can be read more generally in the fact that Palestinians and Israelis, because the history of the one can never be disentangled from the history of the other, their shared history simultaneously divides and binds them, both find themselves in mourning, and what they mourn, even if differently and in incommensurable ways, is themselves. What is most important going forward is our learning from one another as we think about what is happening together. This work has to be collaborative, and I hope that you can experience my talk as an invitation to a conversation. I dedicate my lecture to the memory of Nikos Pulantζάς, to everything he taught us about the violence of state formations, corrosive forms of nationalism and authoritarianism, and the promise of socialist political thought. We all owe him a felt debt. Okay, let's see if this works. Yes. I begin with a date that can no longer be just a date, especially today, when we find ourselves amidst the rise of racism across the globe, an upsurge of authoritarianism and fascism, an intensification of different forms of inequality, an escalation of conflicts and wars of all kinds, an increase in the dispossession of populations and enforced migrations, and an acceleration of environmental catastrophes globally. The date I have in mind today, including all this and more, is October 7th. This date is now a citation, since it encrypts in it a network of other dates, at least 77 years of them, if we recall May 15th, 1948, Nakba Day, the day of the Palestinian catastrophe. The mass displacement and dispossession of more than 700,000 Palestinians from their homes and villages that followed the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. Like then, today too is a day of mourning because the Nakba did not end in 1948. It endures in different but intensified forms with unending cycles of dispossession, erasure, exile, and death. There is no October 7 without this history, which means that October 7 must be read in relation to the long history of displacement, occupation, and violence that is sealed in it. If we are to think October 7, then, the first thing we must do is set it aside, put it in relation to other dates, including among so many others, August 23, 1929, May 15, 1948, June 5, 1967, December 9, 1987, February 25, 1994, September 28, 2000, and July 8, 2014, and this just to begin. As Jacques Derrida notes in his interview on 9/11, one can condemn unconditionally certain acts of terrorism, whether of the state or not, without having to ignore the situation that might have brought them about or even legitimated them. Borrowing his claims about 9/11 and superimposing them onto October 7, we can say that one can condemn the attack of October 7 without having to ignore the conditions that made it possible. Anyone in the world who either organized or tried to justify this attack saw it as a response to the state terrorism of Israel and its complicit allies. But who is the terrorist? The first terrorist? The most terrorists? This question is at once necessary and destined to remain without any answer, Derrida tells us. Necessary because it takes into account an essential fact. All terrorism presents itself as a response in a situation that continues to escalate. It amounts to saying, I am resorting to terrorism as a last resort because the other is more terrorist than I am. I am defending myself, counterattacking. The real terrorist, the worst, is the one who will have deprived me of every other means of responding before presenting himself, the first aggressor, as a victim. It is in this way that the United States, Israel, wealthy nations, and colonial or imperialist powers are accused of practicing state terrorism and thus of being more terrorist than the terrorists of whom they say they are the victims, end quote. The genocide in Gaza has highlighted the centrality of Palestine to the international legal order. As the world continues to face the consequences and legacies of colonialism, Palestine remains the clearest manifestation of the colonial ordering that the international community claims to have overcome. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a historical specificity that, at least metonymically, is a neuralgic point for thinking about wars in the Middle East. And not only there, since several other nation-states remain actively involved in the continuation of these wars. It is a political condensation of several intersecting crises, bringing together a series of fracture points, a crisis of representation, an increasingly authoritarian response to political conflict, the unraveling of the international liberal order, and the politics of race and class. It reinforces a shift to what Nikos Pulantζάς called authoritarian statism, the intensification of authoritarian tendencies within ostensibly democratic institutions and processes. In David Lloyd's words, the sanctity of life may in principle be extended to all, but the sanction to destroy it with impunity has been appropriated by colonial states whose very existence demands the utter dehumanization of their victims. The inhuman and annihilating excess of organizing state force, whose untold destructive forces are now unfolding in total violence on the helpless people of Gaza, can never be morally equated with even the most atrocious acts of the colonized committed in the hope of liberation from an unbearable colonial regime, end quote. But as we know, the most powerful media do not report the horrors that Palestinian people have lived through for decades in the form of apartheid rules, colonial rule and statelessness, arrests without due process, torture and indefinite incarceration, systematized land seizures, routine airstrikes, arbitrary detentions at military checkpoints, the denial of freedom of movement, enforced family separations, and targeted killings. Palestinians have been forced to live in a state of death, under constant surveillance and a decades-long siege that limits and even denies them medication, food, water, electricity, and other resources necessary for even the barest of lives. If the horrors of these last 26 months assume a greater moral importance for the media than the horrors of the last 77 years, Judith Butler notes, then the moral response of the moment threatens to eclipse an understanding of the radical injustices endured by occupied Palestine and forcibly displaced Palestinians, as well as the humanitarian disaster and loss of life happening right now in Gaza, end quote. Israeli violence against Palestinians is overwhelming, and the incremental genocide that has unfolded in Palestine for more than 7 decades has transformed into a spectacular genocidal war, live-streamed by Palestinians in Gaza to the world, even as Israel increasingly restricts journalistic access to the area and targets journalists in unprecedented ways. This restriction has found its proliferating analog in the weaponization of the accusation of anti-Semitism directed toward any criticism of Israeli state violence. But as Derrida writes, the logic of opposition to the state of Israel or to its de facto politics does not necessarily imply any anti-Semitism or even any anti-Zionism, and above all, any revisionism. Pointing to those who fail to recognize the line dividing criticism of the state of Israel from anti-Semitism, he insists on the necessity of questioning the state of Israel, its past or present politics, even the conditions of its foundation, and what has followed from it for over the past half-century, end quote. But as Lloyd notes, No Zionist will ever accept, with however many of the nuances we already give the terms, that Israel's regime is a form of apartheid and that its wars are genocidal, end quote. It is easier for Israel and its allies to condemn any criticism of its deliberate effort to annihilate a population, directly or indirectly, at once and over decades, than to acknowledge their complicity in what they themselves would declare goes in the direction of the worst, a genocidal war machine. Not surprisingly, this is exactly what has happened in the aftermath of the International Criminal Court's effort to issue arrest warrants for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, and of the UN's International Court of Justice's review of South Africa's claim that Israel was committing genocide in relation to how it was perpetrating its war against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, arguing that its prosecution of the war was genocidal in nature because there was an intention to destroy Palestinians in Gaza. Israel has rejected these efforts and allegations, but its rejection is belied by the statements of many of its own officials. They have repeatedly made their genocidal intentions perfectly clear, speaking of collective punishment, mass murder, and ethnic cleansing in the newspapers, at press conferences, and on television. Retired General and former National Security Advisor Giora Eiland has celebrated the spread of epidemics in the Strip as an effective means of its depopulation, admitting that the aim is to create conditions where life in Gaza becomes unsustainable. As a result, he adds, Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist. Yoav Gallant has described Palestinians as human animals to be deprived of food, water, and fuel with the aim of their destruction or removal, and Netanyahu has referred to them as children of darkness. Major General Hassan Aliyan of the Israeli army, echoing Gallant, declared, human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity and no water in Gaza. There will only be destruction. Israel Security Cabinet member and Agriculture Minister Avi Dichter declared early on, we are now rolling out the Gaza Nakba. Even after the UN's International Court of Justice, already on January 26, 2024, which found by a large majority that at least some of the acts and omissions alleged by South Africa to have been committed by Israel in Gaza appear to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Genocide Convention, Israel has continued the expulsion and forced displacement of Palestinians from their homes, depriving them of access to adequate resources, humanitarian assistance, shelter, clothes, hygiene, sanitation, and medical care, in contravention of the court order that Israel immediately halt its military offensive, which may inflict on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life that would bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, end quote. In a powerful and urgent address to the UN Security Council in May 2025, Tom Fletcher, UN Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator, condemned the ongoing humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. He emphasized that Israel is creating inhumane conditions for civilians through total blockade and forced displacement, warning that 2.1 million Palestinians face famine, with 1 in 5 at risk of starvation. Fletcher detailed the collapse of Gaza's healthcare system, the obstruction of humanitarian aid, and targeted attacks on workers, calling the situation a 21st century atrocity. In her March 2024 report for the UN Anatomy of a Genocide, Francesca Albanese already had declared that the overwhelming nature and scale of Israel's assault on Gaza and the destructive conditions of life it has inflicted reveal an intent to physically destroy Palestinians as a group, adding that Israel's genocide on the Palestinians in Gaza is an escalatory stage of a long-standing settler colonial process of erasure. Amnesty International reinforced this assessment in its December 2024 report, declaring that Israel has committed and is continuing to commit genocide against Palestinians in occupied Gaza. But we do not need to wait for a genocide to be fully recognized or fully executed in order to name it. We know that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, not because a court or a human rights group declares this to be the case, but because genocidal intent is explicitly stated, and because it is displayed in the material consequences of the war on Palestinians in Gaza. With the exception of the provisional ceasefire between Israel and Hamas-led Palestinian militant groups in the Gaza Strip from January 19 to March 18, 2025, provisional because during this period Israel committed over 260 ceasefire violations, and as expected, the ceasefire collapsed in mid-March when Israel reneged on its promise to implement a second phase. And the current ceasefire, which Israel has already violated more than 500 times, killing hundreds of Palestinians since the ceasefire went into effect on October 10. Israel has continued its siege in a military campaign that since October 7, 2023, has dropped more than 100,000 tons of explosives on the Gaza Strip and killed over 70,000 Palestinians, over 75% of them women and children, with thousands more missing and tens of thousands more civilians wounded. As the Forensic Architecture Collective noted in its January 2025 report, The Cartography of Genocide, this siege has been exacerbated by unparalleled and catastrophic levels of infrastructural destruction and agricultural damage, and the systematic targeting of vital civilian structures, including hospitals, schools, universities, religious and cultural heritage sites, cemeteries, fields and orchards, water wells and roads, bakeries and homes, all of which have been turned to rubble. In our context, it is notable that over 95% of all educational buildings in Gaza have been wholly or partially destroyed, including all 12 of Gaza's universities, libraries, archives, obliterating the ways in which Palestinians sustain and transmit their culture, history, memory, and values across generations. Terrorism does not only work through death, it can involve letting populations die from hunger, disease, bodily injury from various attacks, lack of medical treatment, and conditions that are simply unlivable. We are witnessing not simply a genocide, but also a scholasticide, a domicide, an ecocide, an epistemicide, and an engineered famine that will affect the conditions of life for Palestinians for generations, as it already has. This is particularly alarming given the shameful lack of global pressure on Israel, especially from the United States, to adhere to international law and the rulings of the International Court of Justice, and to halt the ongoing crime of genocide against the Palestinian people, a crime that has been on full display since October 7, but which was already at work, even if it did not always manifest itself in such spectacular ways. Indeed, the Nakba has never really referenced just one moment and cannot be restricted to 1948. It continues today. As the Palestinian lawyer Rabia Akbaria has explained, the mid-20th century mass expulsion of Palestinians from their homes by Zionist paramilitary forces and then by the army of the newly founded Israeli state transformed the Nakba into a tenacious system of Israeli domination. A Nakba regime grounded in the destruction of Palestinian society and the continuous denial of its right to self-determination. The spectacular violence of conquest, dispossession, and displacement evolved into a brutally sophisticated regime of oppression. Analyzing what he calls the legal anatomy of the ongoing Nakba, he goes on to argue that displacement is the Nakba's foundational violence, fragmentation is its structure, and the denial of self-determination its purpose, end quote. That the present violence has a long history points to the necessity of engaging, analyzing, and countering this history. Tonight, I want to suggest that Fazal Sheik's Erasure Trilogy can be a resource for us as we work to interrupt this long genocidal war. It will have taught us how to approach it, and in particular, how to understand October 7 with all its devastation on so many fronts. Beginning with the 1948 Nakba, Fazal documents its ongoing force, asking us to engage in inheritance that even today belongs to what we still call our future. There can be no thought of the future, he suggests, which is not at the same time an engagement with the afterlives of this historical trauma. Fazal Sheik's multi-volume set of photographs on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, entitled the Erasure Trilogy and published in the spring of 2015, is divided into 3 separate volumes: Memory Trace, Desert Bloom, and Independence Nakba. The photographs seek to explore the legacies of the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, which resulted in the establishment of the State of Israel. From his first visit to Israel and the West Bank in late 2010, Fazal claims that he came to believe that any effort to understand the region had to confront this war and its long-term effects on the divided societies of Israel and Palestine. In his words, the war and its aftermath led to the depopulation of more than 450 Palestinian towns and villages and the flight of an estimated 700,000 Palestinians to neighboring countries, refugee camps, and areas under Israeli military rule. It was in effect the dissolution of Palestinian society and has left a wound that has never healed, end quote. That the wound has never healed means that the violence, trauma, loss, and ruin that were the signature of the war and whose traces live on in the various historical, political, religious, or literary forms that today inherit their legacy do not only belong to the past. If they cannot be said to be behind us, it is because there is no historical after to the trauma of loss and violence. This is why Fazal seeks to recognize and respect the history of that period and to acknowledge the traumatic effects of its legacy. As I worked, he tells us, I often felt as if I was functioning as a kind of conduit, finding and visiting sites of upheaval, combat, and even massacre, which had been depopulated during the war and its aftermath. Then moving across the border, both physical and psychological, to the Arab-Israeli towns of Israel and into the occupied territories, searching for villagers who had fled in 1948. Most of those I talked to had never been back to their homes or villages. When I reached the elders, now in their 80s, 90s, and even some over 100, they shared memories of their former homes and pointed out landmarks or special places they wished me to look for and sometimes to photograph for them. In recounting the events of that time, they did so with an accuracy and emotion that brought the scenes back to life in vivid detail. As the generation of witnesses to the events of 48 begins to pass away, so too the sites, the vestiges of their homes and villages are fading, subsumed into the landscape, vanishing from both view and consciousness, end quote. This is why Fazal suggests his camera seeks to invoke and engage a past that never simply behind us remains a part of the present, even if it is increasingly less visible and legible. It wishes to preserve the traces of a history that is vanishing along with its witnesses, even as the force of this history remains. What is at stake is the possibility of exposing and countering the various processes of erasure that have sought to erase the violence of this history and the acts of erasure themselves. Fazal understands that the anguish at the origin of this history and the anguish at the origin of sight is the anguish that comes from the loss of memory, not only from forgetting or amnesia, but from the effacement of traces. This is why its first desire is to preserve memory. In Memory Trace, we encounter a kind of visual poem dedicated to the past, but to a past that survives in the present, presenting images of the ruins and rubble left behind by the violence of 48. Portraits of Arab Israelis and Palestinians who have lived in the villages that were evacuated and mostly destroyed during the 1948 war, whether displaced by the war or forced into refugee camps, and landscapes that bear the traces of devastation, loss, dispossession, and displacement. The photographs suggest a loss that cannot be recovered, but that nevertheless leaves its enigmatic and mournful traces. The images are accompanied by the site's latitudinal and longitudinal coordinates, a reference to the population and number of houses on the site in 1948, the date on which the village was evacuated and the occupying force and Israeli operation that evacuated it, a brief note about what, if anything, replaced the village in the aftermath of the war, and a note about what is visible on the site today. Each caption ends with a statement about whether the village now has an Israeli name and whether it appears in contemporary maps of Israel. While each photograph evokes the war's violence in its own singular way, they must be read together as a series of photographs that, taking their departure from 48, bear the traces of several acts of remembrance and mourning. Punctuated here and there by the words of the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish and by the words of the men and women Fazal photographs, these traces bear witness to what has been erased or rendered anonymous. They tell us that memory emerges from ruins, from faces that bear witness to mournful histories, landscapes that bear the scars of violence, and shattered remains of buildings that create their own modes of expression. The history that has been effaced makes itself legible in the ruin. This is evident in Darwish's poem, The House Murdered. There, suggesting that the destroyed house bears witness to the destruction of both Palestinian property and lives, that we can imagine an identification between persons and things. The things carry within them the traces of the persons to whom they belong. He writes, "In 1 minute, the entire life of a house is ended. The house murdered is also a mass murder, even if it is empty of its inhabitants. A mass grave of the raw materials needed to build a house with meaning or a poem with no importance in time of war. The house murdered is the amputation of things from their relationships and from the names of emotions and from the need of tragedy to direct its eloquence to contemplate the life of a thing. In each thing there is a being in pain, a memory of fingers, a scent, an image. And houses are killed just like their inhabitants, and the memory of things is killed. Stone, wood, glass, iron, cement are scattered in broken fragments like living beings. And cotton, silk, linen, papers, books are torn to pieces like proscribed words. Plates, spoons, toys, records, faucets, pipes, door handles, fridges, washing machines, flower vases, jars of olives and pickles, canned food, all break just like their owners. Salt, sugar, spices, boxes of matches, pills, contraceptives, antidepressants, strings of garlic, onions, tomatoes, dried okra, rice and lentils are crushed to pieces just like their owners. Rent agreements, marriage documents, birth certificates, water and electricity bills, identity cards, passports, love letters are torn to shreds like their owners' hearts. Photographs, toothbrushes, combs, cosmetics, shoes, underwear, sheets, towels fly in every direction like family secrets broadcast aloud in the devastation. All these things are a memory of the people who no longer have them and of the objects that no longer have the people, destroyed in a minute. Our things die like us, but they aren't buried with us," end quote. When a house is murdered, Darwish tells us, the crushed glass, the iron and cement, the stone and wood are all scattered in broken fragments like living beings. They are analogous to living beings in their vulnerability, in their fragility and mortality, in their capacity to be torn from the context in which they had existed and destroyed. The house that is murdered corresponds to the amputation of things from their relationships. When a house is killed, everything in it is shattered, including the traces of life that had touched all the things that populated the house, leaving their traces on the surfaces of these objects and even inside them. These traces exist as archives of relations that are now orphaned and disarticulated. They become a medium through which both domestic life and a shared historical life can be registered, even if in an encrypted and displaced manner. In the aftermath of destruction, Darwish suggests, things surrender the memories that have sealed within them. To view these shattered remains from the perspective of another time, as when we view photographs taken later, is to register much more and much less than what was legible at the moment of the house's murder, since in the meantime, other forces have contributed to the further ruination of these already fragile remains. The memory carried by things is a memory that is broken and interrupted, like the things and lives that have been lost. Nevertheless, the house, the lives that once inhabited it, and the things that filled it appear as photographic apparatuses that, preserving the traces of their own vanishing, embody the play between survival and destruction that is photography's signature. This is why we could say photography itself begins in ruins, and the War of 1948, the military incursions of the 1950s, the 1956 war, the 1967 war, the 1972 counterinsurgency in the refugee camps of Gaza, the first Intifada of 1987 to 91, and the waves of destruction brought about during the second Intifada of the early 2000s have each generated new layers of rubble that continue to litter the Israeli and Palestinian landscape. Tracing the consequences of David Ben-Gurion's dream of settling the Negev and making the desert bloom, the aerial photographs that comprised Fazal's Desert Bloom volume reveal the myriad forces and actions that have blossomed to displace and erase the Bedouins who have lived in the desert for generations. We can view the transformation wrought on the landscape by military training camps, mining projects, erosion, the forced evacuation and demolition of unrecognized Bedouin villages, the afforestation efforts, the clearing and appropriation of the desert, and the expansion of settlements. What these photographs show is that the alteration and devastation of the Negev desert have gone hand in hand with violence against the Bedouins. Viewed through the lens of Sheikh's camera, the desert comes to us as an archive of what has happened on its shifting surfaces, of what is hidden and sealed in its dunes, of all the efforts to use it to erase the traces of this long, often violent, and contradictory history. Turning from the legacy of the Palestinian Nakba of 1948 to the Bedouin Nakba, beginning in 1948 and continuing to 1953, during which the Israeli military violently expelled an estimated 90% of the 100,000 Bedouin inhabitants of the Negev desert into the West Bank, Gaza, Jordan, and Egypt. Sheikh's photographs record the processes whereby the traces of their settlements and their presence on the land are erased. His photographs and their accompanying captions and testimonials not only register the ruination of villages, settlements, families, communities, and modes of inhabiting the land, but also bear witness to the subsequent camouflaging of these historical acts of erasure and the enduring mechanisms and consequences of this ongoing erasure in the present. Exploring the ways in which the Zionist dream of settling the Negev has transformed the desert, the photographs enable us to see how decades of irrigation and afforestation have reinforced the urbanization, militarization, mining, construction, contamination, destruction, and continued displacement of the Bedouins that have blossomed in the desert. The reforestation campaign, begun by the Jewish National Fund, established in 1901, has planted more than 250 million trees, developed more than 250,000 acres of land, created more than 1,000 parks, and provided the infrastructure for more than 1,500 communities throughout Israel. Each instance of tree planting becomes a means of reclaiming the land and of asserting the right and legitimacy of Jewish return. While serving to mark the process of taking possession of the land, the tree planting campaign, in its almost obsessive preoccupation with literally and figuratively setting down roots, has worked to cover over the hundreds of Palestinian villages destroyed between 1947 and 1949. Forests, parks, and recreational facilities are strategically placed on top of the ruins of destroyed Palestinian villages so that the fast-growing pines can erase the history of Palestinian existence and prevent refugees from ever returning to their homes. Against this violence, Fazal closes his trilogy with a striking series of juxtapositions and repetitions. Independence Nakba consists of a series of 66 diptychs, one diptych for each year from 1948 to 2014, that places together portraits of persons from both sides of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and of gradually increasing age, with the left side of the diptych presenting someone from the Israeli side of the separation wall and the right side presenting someone from the Palestinian side. The double portraits ask us to think not only about the relations that existed between Israelis and Palestinians before the war, Each portrait presents someone who either lived in Palestine before the founding of the Israeli state or someone whose ancestors did, but also about the impossible politics of separation that still today maintains a distinction between Israeli liberation and Palestinian catastrophe. The most powerful element in our experience of the images, though, is that our eyes have to choose the image on which they will focus. While looking at the face of one person, they cannot look at the face of the other at his or her side. In this way, Fazal presents the dilemma at the heart of the conflict, the impossibility of looking at both sides equally and at the same time. Staging a relation across a line of division, the portraits invite us to register the enduring bonds that tie the past, the present, and the future together. A past that preceded the division between independence and the Nakba, a present that still remains haunted and defined by this division, and a possible future that, taking its point of departure from these bonds and divisions, could enable a different tomorrow. This possibility is furthered and complicated by the fact that, and this is the only time Fazal has ever done this, the persons in the photographs are presented anonymously, a gesture that erases them, even as it permits us to imagine a relation between them more easily, as if the act of memorialization must itself begin in an act of erasure, as if the act of responding historically requires a vanishing. This is why I would say that together, these three books appear as a training manual on how to read historically, and in particular, how to read photographs in moments of danger. These images trace the contours of an ongoing conflict whose history begins where memory is endangered, where it emerges only to disappear, where it even appears in its disappearance. What Fazal knows is that history and memory can only occur to the extent that they ceaselessly move away from us. If it were not for the disappearing trace of their transience, history and memory would never happen. But if we can no longer believe that memory and commemoration alone will help us prevent disaster in the future, we are still obliged to imagine a means of remembering what remains without remaining. What destroyed and ruined still demands to be preserved, even if within a history that can never enter into history. If nothing can replace what has been lost to history, or what will continue to be lost to history, can we still interrupt history's course and catastrophes, or must we endlessly reiterate and enact this condition of loss and displacement? This question helps delineate the stakes of Fazal's photographic project, and it also tells us why he believes that we must learn to read the past, and more precisely, the irretrievable images of the past, in a way that, following Walter Benjamin, knows how these images threaten to disappear as long as we do not recognize ourselves in them, but ourselves as the ones who, touched by the ruins of time and history, are no longer simply ourselves, and no longer situated in only one moment in time. Fazal's images tell us that memories never appear alone, and that even single memories are themselves multiple and multiply related to other memories. It is because memories are always embedded within a network of historical traces that includes the memories of others that we must learn to read historically. Although each of Fazal's books takes on a different set of figures, including, among others, portraits, landscapes, ruins, deserts, trees and forests, and the Israeli wall, they are presented in relation to one another as part of a trilogy that asks us to follow the red threads between them. These threads are not simply historical, political, ideological, religious, or philosophical. They are also visual. The visual echolalia that can be traced from one volume to another encourage us to think of the ways in which portraits can become landscapes, and landscapes can appear as portraits. Dispossessed and displaced Palestinians can become living ruins, like the now shattered buildings in which their families used to live. The weathered and ruined interior walls or ceilings of former homes and shrines bear on their surfaces marks and patterns that resemble the landscapes we see in Fazal's aerial photographs, and even reference, even if only in an encrypted way, the settlements that dot the desert landscape. Many of the photographs in Desert Bloom present aerial shots of desert plains and mountains that, viewed from above, look like a grain of wood or the roots of trees, as if the afforestation projects were themselves transforming the landscape into trees or into tree-like formations. And the portraits of Israelis and Palestinians with which Fazal closes his trilogy often suggest more than simply visual resemblances among them, and indeed reference the shared histories and memories that otherwise would remain invisible. The visual rhymes within and across these three books let us know that images always have to be read syntactically in relation to other images. If read historically, each photograph can be shown to bear a relation not only to all the other photographs in the series, but also to the traces of the entire complicated history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But what kind of history can photographs tell? And how might they train history to read? Bringing together the past and the present, Fazal's photographs tell us that now does not name a present, just as then cannot be reduced to the past. It is because the traces carried by these photographs include references to the past, the present, and the future, and in such a way that none of these can be isolated from the other, that they cannot present the traces of the destruction they recall without at the same time shattering their capacity to present. This is why we might say the photograph both preserves and shatters, conserves while displacing. I begin again, but this time with what is perhaps the most significant, difficult, and permanent feature of the conflict, the question around which much of the conflict is organized, and which is also at the heart of the photographic act itself, the question of memory. What is memory? What does it mean to remember? To remember without betraying the past and without making a future impossible. What does it mean to remember when remembrance never appears without forgetfulness? If memory involves evoking the past or the dead, how is it that these can be made to speak? How is it that the past can survive in the present and inform the future silently, but without pacifying or silencing a single torment or a single violence? What can memory be when it seeks to remember the trauma of loss and displacement? How is it that the dispossessed can resist their disappearance or erasure, even in memory? In what way does death and ruin leave behind a decomposing trace that gives meaning to the memory, the violence, the wounds, the protests, the cries of anger or suffering, the several death sentences on which a people, Palestinian, for example, has struggled to found itself? How can an event that takes place only in its passage leave something behind that inaugurates and even composes a history? In this instance, a history of dispossession and diaspora, a history of displacement, without which the history of Palestine or even the history of Israel could never be written. It is perhaps because we have not fully understood the power and force of memory and its essential relation to forgetfulness and betrayal that there can be no end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The war has given evidence over the course of several decades, not simply of the inevitable complicity between victory and defeat, between war and the rhetoric of peace, but also between memory and forgetfulness. And these complicities have even revealed a determination to make war permanent. The so-called Middle East peace process has been nothing else than what Michel Foucault once called a coded war, the continuation of war through other means. What is at stake in this war may be questions of territory and the ownership of land, of legacies and inheritances, political and national identities, ethnic, religious, and cultural conflicts, discrimination and economic oppression, and violence and retaliations of all kinds. But all these can be viewed through the lens of what Darwish called, already in 1973, a struggle between two memories. However various its manifestations may be from one context to another, the question of memory touches every dimension of the conflict. There, in fact, would be no conflict were it not for this struggle over what memory can be, over which memory has more authority or force. As Darwish notes, pointing to the role of Jewish memory in the conflict and to its antagonism toward Arab memory in general, Jewish memory is one of the basic components of the claim to a right in Palestine. Yet it is incapable of admitting that others also possess the same memory. Israelis refuse to live side by side with Arab memory. They refuse to admit the existence of this memory. According to Gil Hochberg, the conflict is between an Israeli-Jewish memory that is never identical to itself, but which nevertheless establishes its relationship to the land of Israel, its right of inheritance to the land on the basis of biblical texts and archaeological evidence, and a Palestinian memory, which is also never a single memory, but which, as Darvish notes, preserves a historical connection to the land through a people who, because they have lived on the land for generations, can tell when the rains will come from the smell of a rock. What is at stake, Darvish suggests, is not only the question of who lived on the land first, of who has a more intimate relation to it, but also the question of who has experienced the most injustice. The struggle over the memory of victimization, over who has the greater right to claim victimization, becomes a matter of life and death, and one in which death and mourning open onto historical, political, and even philosophical and existential issues. Addressing a personified Israel that refuses to acknowledge Palestinian memory, Darvish writes, "You do not recognize my existence, and you nullify my link to this country, claiming it to be nothing more than a passing courtship that will disappear in time. And how did you prove this? By violence and force alone. This is the way of the world. The justification of the powerful carry more weight always." End quote. There can be no national identity that does not assert its own memory over and against that of another. This means, however, that a memory can only achieve ascendancy over an other's memory through a process of remembrance that is simultaneously a process of forgetting and erasure, that works to forget and erase the other's memory, and even the relation between the one and the other. The argument that nations emerge in relation to a kind of amnesia, in relation to a forgetting of the violence with which they are always founded, is often traced back to Ernest Renaud's 1882 lecture, What is a Nation? In his words, forgetting, I would even go so far as to say historical error, is a crucial factor in the creation of a nation, which is why progress in historical studies often constitutes a danger for nationality. Indeed, historical inquiry brings to light deeds of violence which took place at the origin of all political formations. Unity is always affected by means of brutality, end quote. The forgetting or erasure of this founding violence takes many forms, and in the Israeli-Palestinian context, it includes the characterization of the Palestinian villages that were destroyed and violently depopulated as simply deserted or abandoned. Deforestation projects that cover and erase the traces of these devastated and once inhabited villages, the renaming of these once Palestinian villages with Hebrew names and their elimination from contemporary maps, the denial of the right of return to Palestinians who were expulsed from their homes, and all the various ways in which Palestinian presence is either marginalized or made to disappear. This is why any effort to remember or memorialize the Nakba endangers the myth of origins on which Israel has made its claims to sovereignty over the occupied territories, and why it is consequently not surprising that Israel criminalized the commemoration of Nakba in 2011. If Ilan Gorziev and Ilan Pape have pointed to the mutual negation that informs the struggle between two memories, as they put it, each side sees itself as a sole victim while totally negating the victimization of the other. Darvish suggests that the Jewish history of suffering overshadows and even erases the Palestinian memory of loss, and in doing so ensures the forgetting and erasure of Palestinian history. He identifies the exiled marginal space in which he lives with a camera, suggesting that history depends on the force that sustains it. You had to choose the margin to know where you stand. The margin is a window looking out on the world. You are neither in it nor outside it. The margin is a cell without walls. The margin is a personal camera that selects the images it wants from the scene, so that the king is not the king, and David's slingshot is nothing but Goliath's weapon. Is it true that the first one to write his story will win the land of the story? But writing requires claws to carve into rock. End quote. Writing from the margin of his exile, his personal camera selects images that enable him to reverse and revise the history that, coming with the might of what he elsewhere calls the gigantic bulldozer of history, carves its traces into rock, according to the dimension of a sacred myth and armed to the teeth. What gives Israel's memory more force, in other words, and even the capacity to transform David's slingshot into one of its own weapons, is that it is supported by a machine of storytelling that erases the history and stories of Palestine, just as it displaces and dispossesses its people, and that in turn is reinforced by a war machine. The ambiguities of defeat and victory that define the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, however, point to the dangers that can arise if these ambiguities are reduced or erased in the name of simplification or in the name of triumphalist nationalist declaration. If historiography begins in an identification with the discourse of the victor, it is because it is based on a perception of history as victory. Its official history is governed by the perspective of the victor. It is because it speaks with an authority and power that prevents us from hearing in history a claim for all it seeks to silence. What is lost and forgotten with each imagined or declared win are those who have fought, suffered, and died. The violence and death of war run the risk of being forgotten and erased in the jubilation of victory and of sovereignty. This is why the only way to resist the hubris of victory, the only way to prevent us from forgetting that any victory comes at a cost, and at times even at the cost of this same victory, is to remember the war's traumatic consequences and effects, to keep the memory of the dead and dispossessed. In a prose poem entitled The Humor of Eternity, I think I'm an image behind, Darwin suggests, that only photography has the chance of keeping this memory of the dead and the dispossessed alive, and in particular of training history to read in general. I wish to pause over this passage since I think it may help us delineate the contours and aims of Fazal's own project, which, as I have suggested, comes in the form of a training manual for reading images. Putting loss, graves, photographs, and history in relation to one another, Darwish writes, "Graveyards have the dignity of air, the authority of dust. You say farewell to your friend Mahmoud and await your turn. The smell of wilting flowers and the rustling of trees transport you far away to the place that lies beyond matter, to your final address in some part of nothingness. But you are thinking of something simpler. Graves are mattresses. They seem like comfortable places to sleep. An occupant of such a grave would not lie staring up at his earthy sky, and like his counterpart in the graveyard near the Place de Trocadero in Paris, would be part of everyday life, being so close to cafes, museums, and the social interplay of the living. Life was within reach of his marble headstone, and the abundance of flowers, trees, birds, and people surrounding him make it unnecessary for him to go out for walks after he has spent his life savings on procuring the privacy of this permanent address. There are some graves that make absence into visible matter, like those broken down graves in the desert, far from trees and water. There is no friend for the sleeper who burns in the heat of the summer and freezes from the cold in the winter, as if death continues without end, since death is freed from the metaphor of sleep. But those who oversee the construction of their graves, furnishing them with their photographs, do not think about the comfort to be had from sleeping in friendly proximity to the living, but only of training history to read. They think also of something more complex, of bribing eternity, failing to understand that eternity does not visit graves and loves to joke." End quote. In a passage that oscillates between death and life, sleeping and waking, memory and forgetfulness, presence and absence, and eternity and transience. The narrator registers his finitude and mortality in the death of his friend. This finitude is mirrored in nature herself as she signals her transience with wilting flowers and the rustling of trees, in order to transport the living and the dead to their final resting place. But the dead buried in cities, close to cafes, museums, and the social interplay of the living, retain a relation to the living that enables us and them to imagine their death as simply a form of sleep. Surrounded by an abundance of flowers, trees, birds, and people, they seem to maintain a relation to life that prevents us from fully registering their death, and instead to imagine an ongoing relation with them, to think of their survival and even of ours. On the other hand, the now broken graves in the desert, far from trees and water, make absence more visible and tangible, more impossible to overcome or neglect. Their isolation keeps their dead separate from the lives of the living, and therefore prevents death from assuming the false metaphor of sleep. The dead in these broken down graves stay closer to death than to life, and because of this, run a greater risk of losing their relation to the living, of being forgotten, especially since the memorials that would remember them are no longer intact, but broken down in ruins. The authority of dust has more force in the desert. This is why those who build the graves and furnish them with photographs of the dead do not do so in order to pretend that the dead have an ongoing relation to the living. Neither they nor the dead are seduced by the metaphor that would associate death with sleep, but in order to train history to read. It is only when the dead body transitions from something that was once alive into being a thing that it can become legible and not imagined as what it is not. It is only when we acknowledge that these bodies will not wake up, that they are not simply asleep, that we can read them historically, and without believing that we can bribe eternity in any way. At the same time, and this is what is so remarkable about this passage, both situations suggest that the possibility that the dead can survive in memory, like a kind of ghost, that a relation between life and death, between the living and the dead, structures our relation to the past. What is at stake is whether this past can survive in a meaningfully historical way, and the poem suggests the means of such a possibility would seem to be photography. Photography does not simply identify the dead, prevent them from becoming anonymous, from being forgotten, but it also becomes a means of training history to read. Photography helps record, document, preserve, and even present the traces of the past, and in a way that permits us to keep the memory of the past alive, even if it cannot be fully reconstructed. It enables the dead buried in desert graves to retain a relation to the living, even if only in the form of an embodied memory trace that can continue to circulate among the living. Like the ones who build the graves in the desert, Fazal places his photographs alongside the graves and the dead as markers on the ruins and traces of different memorial forms, and asks us to read these traces, the ones he produces and the ones he seeks to encrypt in the surface of his photographs as traces. This is why, taken together, Fazal's photographs suggest the plurality of traces buried in each of their surfaces. By placing the photographs on the ruins and traces of the displaced and dispossessed, of the dead who will never awaken again, Fazal reminds us that the photograph has always been associated with death, has always been structured around the absence of what it presumably represents, which is why death and mourning belong to the photographic experience. What survives in a photograph is also the survival of the dead. The conjunction of death and the photographed is in fact the principle of photographic certitude. The photograph is a cemetery. It recounts a history of ghosts and shadows, exploring the relations between loss and survival, memory and forgetting, the past and the present, the dead and the living. Fazal evokes our relation to several deaths, including those produced by war, dispossession, displacement, and violence of all kinds. but also to the images and words, the photographs and texts that expose, record, archivize, work against, and sometimes conceal these histories. Fazal engages the stakes of photography and history by generating sites of memory in which the past is brought to bear on the present in order to articulate the conditions for a politics of mourning that would also be a politics of the future. He provides us with an opportunity to understand the ways in which photographs can train history and us to read, together and separately, but always in relation to one another. It is necessary to repair, Derrida writes, as much as possible, wherever things are still reversible. It is necessary to repatriate as much as possible, to transfigure the most legitimate grievances, to share the land, to share what we call in an old language, and we must urgently change, sovereignty. In particular in Jerusalem and the so-called places of worship or sacred places, these places in which it is necessary to seek inspiration for peace and not for war, end quote. Like Derrida, Fazal aligns himself with and even anticipates Rabia Egbariya's own claims for what is most needed today. In closing, I want to suggest that we hear in Egbariya's language the promised realization of much of what I have traced in Fazal's photographs. For the question of Palestine to be truly resolved, he tells us, the international community must grapple with the ongoing Nakba. Zionism, only one modality of Jewish existence in Palestine, is conditioned upon the subjugation of the Palestinian people. There is a long and rich history of Jewish existence in Palestine that is not premised on systemic violence, domination, and ethno-national supremacy. Drawing from this tradition may provide inspiration, even though Zionism and its ultimate manifestation in the ongoing Nakba have ruptured and restructured reality in myriad ways that hinder our ability to imagine such futures. Undoing the Nakba does not mean resurrecting a past, but reimagining a future. We must start from recognition and move toward reconstitution. Yet before any reconstitution can take place, a number of fundamental issues must be addressed. These include return of those Palestinian refugees who desire it, reparations for the victims of the ongoing Nakba, and redistribution of the material resources. Taken together, these components therefore provide an initial legal framework to remedy the ongoing Nakba. Recognition, return, reparations, redistribution, and reconstitution. The road to undoing the ongoing Nakba and achieving justice in Palestine may be tortuous because it stands to disrupt international power structures and radically transmute existing global hierarchies. This is precisely what makes Palestine a possibility that is all the more important to pursue. Palestine and the Nakba offer rich universalist lessons to the world. If apartheid taught us about the dangers of racialism and the possibility of reconciliation, and the Holocaust taught us about the banality of evil and warned never again, the Nakba can complicate our understanding of these lessons by reminding us that group victimhood is not a fixed category, and that a victimized group may easily become victimizers. That once the abuses of the Nakba are redressed, Palestinians will also have to transcend their own victimhood. That we must ensure we always stand in solidarity with the oppressed and the dehumanized. That people need not always be perfect victims to qualify for freedom, dignity, and fundamental rights. Only once we realize these hard truths, Palestine will set us all free, end quote. Egbariya's claims can be surmised from the photographic traces Fazal has bequeathed to us, which serve as a resource for reconstructing the history that has destined us to witness the endurance of the Palestinian Nakba. In the words of Hassan Abu Kamar, nearly 2 months into the ceasefire, Gaza remains suspended in limbo, waiting for the world to see that the genocide has not ended, it has only changed its form, end quote. As we know, and I'm not the first to say this, we will only be free when Palestine is free. If such a world can ever be inaugurated, if there can ever be a future that will not simply be a repetition of the past, it may well be enabled by work like that of Fazal Sέikh, and with our engagement with everything that is sealed in it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I should say that it's extremely meaningful for me to be able to deliver this talk here with all of you, so thank you.
Τι να πούμε μετά από αυτή τη διάλεξη. Ευχαριστούμε πάρα πολύ τον καθηγητή Καντάβα για αυτή την εμπνευσμένη διάλεξη. Εγώ προσωπικά τον ευχαριστώ θερμά γιατί μέσα από την συνάντησή μας γνώρισα αυτό το τρίτομο συγκλονιστικό φωτογραφικό έργο που δεν το γνώριζα, του Σέικ, στο οποίο στηρίχθηκε η διάλεξη, που όχι μόνο φανερώνει τη βία που έχει συντελεστεί και συντελείται, αλλά ακυρώνει και την απόπειρα διαγραφής. Και με αυτόν τον τρόπο γράφει και αυτό ιστορία. Σας ευχαριστώ όλους και όλες που ήσασταν απόψε μαζί μας. Η διάλεξη του καθηγητή Καντάβα θα μεταφραστεί και θα εκδοθεί από το Ινστιτούτο. Θέλω να ευχαριστήσω επίσης από αυτό το βήμα θερμά τους διερμηνείς από τα αγγλικά και στη νοηματική. Και να σας πω ότι αυτή η εκδήλωση δεν θα μπορούσε να γίνει χωρίς την ουσιαστική συμβολή του Ανδρέα Μαράτου, της Τζένης Διαμαντοπούλου, της Τάλιας Κοκκινάκη, της Σοφίας της Τηλιανού και όλου του προσωπικού του Ινστιτούτου, μαζί με τους συνεργάτες. Βλέπω εδώ τον Μάρκο, τη Μυρσίνη, όλους και όλες που συνέβαλαν πολύ ουσιαστικά για να την πραγματοποιήσουμε. Καλό μας βράδυ και καλά Χριστούγεννα. Εμείς από το Γενάρη ξεκινάμε την επόμενη δράση μας. Είναι μια έκθεση που οργανώνουμε στο Κέντρο Τεχνών του Δήμου Αθηναίων με θέμα τη μετανάστευση και το ναυάγιο του Σπύλου. Θα διαρκέσει έναν ολόκληρο μήνα. Ο τίτλος της έκθεσης είναι «Τυφλό σημείο» και το θέμα της οι μεταναστευτικές ροές. Θα σας περιμένουμε και εκεί. Δεν άκουσα. Κάτι μου λέει η Θάλια εδώ. Μου θυμίζει επίσης τα σεμινάρια του Ινστιτούτου Νίκος Πουλαντζάς που θα ξεκινήσουν επίσης τον επόμενο μήνα. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ. Thank you so much.